Samacham and Beis at the bottom line. Mitsudos chayiv va'ofos v'dagim yesh b'hem v'chule. We saw a series of halachos where the rabbis declared it to be gezel, but not technically gezel, not technically theft, but theft because of darkei shalom, because of preserving peace within society. And then Rabbi Yossi had disagreed. He said, no, it really is gezel. It's not just because of keeping the peace, but rather because of gezel. So the first one, or one of the first ones that we saw, was if a person is a trapper and he sets up a trap for an animal in the wild, and you go ahead and find that animal ensnared in the trap. So the Mishnah had said that really technically it's hefker, you're allowed to take it, but mipnei darkei shalom, it's gezel. So the Gemara wants to clarify. It says, Ba'ozle ve'ohare kuli alma lo pligi. Everyone agrees that if the trap has a receptacle, like a net, or some other kind of box kind of trap or something like that, in those situations, the trap actually is kona the animal on behalf of the owner of the receptacle. So in that situation, it's not just a darkei shalom issue, it really is gezel if you were to take the animal. Ki pligi belechi v'kokari. The machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi, whether it's technically gezel or not, is only in a situation where the trap does not have a receptacle, such as a hook, or some kind of snaring instrument which would snare the animal without actually enveloping the animal in its snare. So, let's say, Rashi gives an example of where you string up a line with hooks on it in the river. So the fish get caught on the hooks. There's no receptacle there. So that's where the Chachamim say that it's a darkei shalom issue, and Rabbi Yossi says it's actual gezel. And then the next example is Mitzias Cheres Shaita V'chule Rabbi Yossi Omer Gezel Gamor. Another example of where this machlokus exists is if a child or a person of unsound mind were to find a lost object. So technically there's no kinyan. They can't acquire anything. So you could grab it from them technically. However, the Chachamim said, no, mipnei darkei shalom, because of the ways of the peace, you have to let them keep it. And Rabbi Yossi says it's actual gezel. So that seems also problematic, because how could Rabbi Yossi say that there's a kinyan to this child when clearly there is no kinyan? Amar Rav Chisda gezel gomer midivreihem. So Rav Chisda clarifies, and he says, let me make sure you understand. Rabbi Yossi is not suggesting that there's a biblical violation of gezel. Of course, he has to acknowledge that there's no kinyan for this child, and so it's only gezel midirabanan. So then the question becomes, well, then what's the machlokus between the two? If they're both agreeing that it's gezel and it's only midirabanan, so then what are they arguing about? So the Gemara says, l'may nafkamina lahotziu b'dayanim. The answer is this: according to the Chachamim, it's only gezel because of darkei shalom. So therefore, after the fact, you cannot litigate. If someone were to take that child's candy that he found, you could not take that person to Beis Din. You're the father of the child, the kid is crying. You can't take that guy to Beis Din because it's only a darkei shalom halacha. But according to Rabbi Yossi, he says it's gezel midirabanan, to the point where you can actually take him to Beis Din, and Beis Din would paskin in your favor. That's the machlokas. It's only a post facto, a b'diavad situation. Can you litigate against the guy or not? Next, Amar of Chisda gezel. Ani haminakef berosh hazayis mashatachta v'chulei. The next case we saw is if you have a man who's up in a tree and he's whacking or shaking the tree to get the olives to fall off the tree. Whatever falls to the ground really technically is hefker because he hasn't made a formal kinyan. But mipnei darkei shalom, you have to let him keep it because look at all the work he's doing. So Tana imliket v'nasan biyad hareza gezel gomer. The Brisa there too qualifies it and says that that's only true if he whacked or shook the tree without touching the olives. But let's say he plucked the olives by hand, so they're actually in his hand, and then he throws them to the ground. So there he was kona them, and if you were to take the olives on the ground, you'd actually be a gazlan midioraisa even.
Confused. Whose tree is this? How can anybody even touch it?
Let's say it's a hefker tree. It's a hefker tree. It's in Rishus Harabim.
Okay.
It's a Rishus Harabim tree, right? So Rav Kahana have ka'azah lehutzel chazia lahu gavra da have shadi upye v'konatran tomare. So Rav Kahana was once traveling to the town of Hutzal, and on the outskirts of Hutzal he sees a man who is hitting with a stick and the dates are falling down. Now, that's the way Rashi learns the story. Tosfos has a slightly different interpretation. We'll see in just a second. So, Azal kaman kit va'achil. So, Rav Kahana saw the dates falling to the ground, so he started to pick them up and eat them. So, Tosfos is bothered. How can you understand that Rav Kahana would not at least be concerned about the Darkei Shalom issue? So granted, it's not Gezel Gomer, but what about Darkei Shalom? So Tosfos therefore learns that that's not the case that the guy was whacking with a stick. Tosfos says the guy was on the tree, and he was cutting down the palm fronds. And Rav Kahana thought that since the guy is only cutting down fronds, he doesn't want the dates at all. And the dates were falling to the ground, so there's not even a Darkei Shalom issue to be concerned about. Because he said to himself, with fronds like these, who needs... Anyway, so Amar Lei... Okay. So anyway, who needs a date? Anyway, so Amar Lei... So, Amar Lei, Chazimar... So he says, so the farmer says to Rav Kahana, he says, excuse me, I want you to know that I was kona these dates by hand. In other words, before I let them fall to the ground, I held them in my hand and I was kona them. So he was so impressed with this farmer's halachic knowledge. And he said, I'm traveling to Hutzal, where Rabbi Yoshi is the great Rebbe in the Posek. That must be the reason why you're so knowledgeable, because you're a Talmud of Rabbi Yoshia. And he said that Rabbi Yoshia is a tzaddik, the foundation of the world. In other words, he was praising Rabbi Yoshia for the great knowledge of the Balabatim of the town of Hutzal. Okay.
The ground underneath the tree is similar to the nets of the fish. In other words, it's considered enough of a receptacle, the ground?
No. It's hefker. Halachically, it's hefker if the guy wasn't kind of the dates or the olives. Right, and so that's why it's only because of Darkei Shalom. It's Rishus Harabim, so they're really technically hefker, right. But Mipnei Darkei Shalom, you have to let him keep it. Yeah, that's
he praised his Rebbe, but he didn't apologize to the guy for eating it.
Well, he stopped once he discovered that the guy was kona them and he wanted the dates, so he stopped. Anyway, remember a couple of days ago I went apoplectic because of this law of you can't protest when a Gentile poor man takes the gleanings of the Yisrael. Even though they're meant for the Jew, you have to mipnei darkei shalom. You have to let a Gentile take the charity also. So Tana Rabbanan, and this is the source of the halacha that I told you is explicit in the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, mefarnesim aniyei nachrim im aniyei Yisrael, that you have an obligation to provide charity. Shloimi.
Here it is,
Shloimi. Tana Rabbanan, here's the Brisa. Mefarnesim aniyei nachrim aniyei Yisrael.
Okay.
You have an obligation to provide sustenance for the Gentile poor together with the Jewish poor. So you have to visit the Gentile sick together with the Jewish sick. By the way, whenever I go to the hospital, 2 guys in a room, 3 guys in a room, I walk past the Gentile, I say, God bless you, sir, may God send you quick healing. That's our obligation. That's not lifnim mishuras adin. That's not the rabbi doing, it's the rabbi's gig, That's a Jew's obligation. You walk past a Gentile, and you have a mitzvah of mipnei darkei shalom of bikur cholim. Don't just walk past the person to get to your Jewish friend. Show him what a Jew does. Show what bikur cholim is. That's the Gemara. And it's in the Shulchan Aruch as well. Why people have forgotten this halacha? Because we were living for hundreds of years in the shtetl and they didn't want to know from us. We were so isolated and they were so busy killing us, they didn't want to know that we could do anything nice for them. So we forgot this and it became part of our consciousness. But look at what the Gemara says. Look at what it says and don't ignore that part of the Shulchan Aruch. Good?
I'm a nice guy.
The Kovrin Meisei Nachim and Meisei Yisrael Mibnei Darkei Shalom. And we also have to take care of the burial of the Gentile dead. If there's someone in the Jewish community and that's a Gentile we know doesn't have anyone to take care of the burial, then it's the Jewish community's responsibility, Mibnei Darkei Shalom. And Rashi points out, not that we bury him in the Jewish cemetery, that's not what we're talking about. We bury him in a Gentile cemetery, right? Because we have to preserve the Kedusha of the Jewish cemetery. But we still have to take care of the burial. It's the Darkei Shalom. It's the proper way of preserving the peace with our non-Jewish neighbors. Next Mishnah. Okay.
Never opposite.
What?
Never opposite.
Never opposite. No, never opposite. Okay. What's that?
What does it mean, in Masay Yisrael? What is that phrase? Why does it say with?
As for taking care of the financial needs, just like
bearing the mace, not in Masay
The Kover Masay Nachrim in
Masay Yisrael. Just like we take care of, we have to bury them with, just together with the taking care of the needs of the Jewish
not
dead.
Physically together.
We take care of the needs. No, right, not physically together, but right, just like we take care of the Jews, we take care of them.
In a road, you see a body, a Goyish body, you should dig it and put it in the ground.
No, don't do that, because the police will arrest you for disposing of a corpse illegally. But what you should, right, no, but what you should do is you should, yeah.
The Rashi says something about that only, we don't agree with him, but he says, talking about if you found them together, that's what is obligated, but he says it really applies even if you don't.
Oh, right. Rashi says, because Rashi's talking in what would commonly take place. When would you find Jews, a Gentile in need of burial? You'd find them if you found a whole bunch of corpses strewn out because of a crusade, right? That's Rashi's world, right? So you get don't ignore the Gentile corpses. Take care of all the corpses. That's right. Yeah.
Somebody non-Jewish. So
that's right. Absolutely. Okay. Next Mishnah. Mash'eles isha lechaverta hachashud al hashvias nafu kfar v'reichayim v'tanur avolo taver v'lo titchan ima. So the first part of our Mishnah, again, this all has to do with darkei shalom. You see, normally if you know that a Jew is not observant in certain halacha, you shouldn't do anything to aid and abet them, even remotely, to do something that's going to help them violate Jewish law. You know, this always becomes a problem when you're dealing with non-religious relatives. You know, to what extent do you help them, whether it's Chilul Shabbos or treif or whatever it is. So this Mishnah deals with a situation that, let's say a woman knows that her neighbor is not meticulous in Shemitah observance, and so she may have grain in her house that needed to be disposed of because it was Shemitah produce, and she still keeps it in her house. So you can't actively help her prepare that into food, but what you are allowed to do, even though it would be preferable to just ignore her and not help her at all, but that would create problems with darkei shalom. So mipnei darkei shalom, you can lend her a sieve, a colander, a mill, and even you can lend her an oven in order for her to do whatever she wants, but you can't actively help her, and therefore lo tover v'lo titchanima, but you can't help her separate the grain, you can't grind the grain with her. You can just let her use your stuff, but you can't do any actions with her. The next case of the Mishnah is Isha Eishes Chaver Masheles Leishes Am Haaretz Nafa Ukevara Uvoreris, that the wife of a Chaver, which is someone who's meticulous and knowledgeable in halachic observance, has a neighbor who's the wife of an Am Haaretz. And the question with an Am Haaretz is, what do you have to worry about? So one issue may be tithing, the other issue may be Tumah issues. So we'll see, it's either got to do with Meiser, or it's got to do with Tumah. So you're allowed to lend her, again, a sieve, a colander, uboreres v'tochenes, and you can even help her separate the grain, and tochenes, and to grind it into flour. Umerakedes ima, you can help her sift the flour. Avol mishatateles hamayim lo siga ima. But once she pours the water into the flour, then you can't help her anymore. Because you're not allowed to help someone who's about to do an Aveira. Now, what Aveira are we talking about? So Rashi tells us, and the Gemara is going to clarify this, is that the issue here is you're worried about Tumah. The reason you're worried about Tumah is because once the water hits the flour, it becomes Chayiv in Chala, the mitzvah of taking Chala, and you have to worry that maybe the wife of the Am Haaretz is not Tohar, and she's going to touch the Chala tithe in a state of Tumah, and that's not permitted. Okay, but all the only things that we do permit is because of darkei shalom, those limited things that we do permit. We also are allowed to help Gentiles during the Shemitah year, And it's not clear from the Mishnah, it's a little bit vague what we do to help them. The Gemara will have to clarify. And finally, V'shoel and B'shlomim Mibnei Darkei Shalom. And when you see a Gentile, you have to say, Shalom Aleichem, Reb Gentile, Reb Goy, how are you? In other words, you're supposed to greet them. And Rashi says, even though potentially you're invoking God's name, because the way they used to bless people was that Yivarechecha Adonai, right? They would say, God bless you, sir. So you're invoking God's name potentially in vain? No, Darkei Shalom says even use God's name. God bless you, sir. Right? That's what you're supposed to greet even a Gentile. The Gemara now says, Maishna Reisha Umaishna Seifa. So the first question is, the Reisha was talking about someone who's suspect of not handling Shemitah produce properly. And the Seifa is talking about a woman who is the wife of an Am Haaretz. Why are there two standards for the two? In other words, what is the difference between the two? Because the standard for the first part is you can't do anything active with her, and in the Eishes Am Haaretz, you're allowed to at least grind with her and do everything up until the water hits the flour. Amar Abaye, Rov Am Haaretz Ma'asranei. So Abaye says, it's because we're not worried about any agricultural isser when it comes to the wife of an Am Haaretz, because we can assume that most Amoratzim have tithed. So you're not aiding and abetting her to take something that's tevel. We can assume that she tithed it properly. So Rava Amar Hacha Ba'am Haaretz the Reb Meir V'tuma V'tahara de Rabbanan. And Rava says, I disagree. Rava is more machmir. He says if it really is the wife of an actual, what we call an Am Haaretz in the vernacular, so then you do have to worry that maybe she didn't tithe it properly, even though there's a majority that does. But what we're talking about in our Mishnah is an Am Haaretz according to Rabbi Meir's definition. You see, Rabbi Meir has a very high bar, right, to define you as a chaver. He says that even if you eat chulin in a state of tumah, which is totally permitted by the Torah, you become an Am Haaretz in Rabbi Meir's book. You're allowed to eat chulin in a state of tumah. So there's a rabbinical stringency that for the elite community of scholars, they would not eat even chulin in a state of tumah. So that is what Rabbi Meir calls an Am Haaretz. And so what's the concern? The Tanya ezehu Am Haaretz kol shein ochel chulav b'tahara divrei Reb Meir. That's Reb Meir's definition. If you eat your chulin in a state of tumah, you're an Am Haaretz in Reb Meir's book. The Chachamim omrim kol sheinu ma'aser peirosav. And the Chachamim say no, it's got nothing to do with tumah and tahara. You're an Am Haaretz if you don't tithe properly. So using Rabbi Meir's definition, so what is the concern then? The concern then is that we're dealing with the laws of tumah. And we only permit you to work with this woman even though there's a potential for tumah with chulin, but only because of darkei shalom. Hold your question. So then the Gemara says, but wait a minute. But 1 second, says the Gemara. I don't understand. You're telling me once the water hits the flour, only there do you have to worry about tumah. Why? If we know that there's a concept in the laws of tumah that produce is only subject to be makabel tumah, to become tameh, if it is first come in contact with water. So we must be talking about a case where the flour and the grain from the time of harvest never came in contact with water. So then why are you only telling me that the heter to grind with her is only because of darkei shalom? If there's been no hechsher l'tumah, if there's been no contact with water of this grain, so then what's the problem at all? So the Gemara says, no, you don't understand. The Gemara says, reisha v'seifa b'tumah v'tahara, but v'reisha b'tumas chulin v'seifa b'tumas chala. The Gemara's answer is, as I had foreshadowed from Rashi, is that, no, the grain already has become huchsher to be makabel tumah. But there's nothing wrong with you working with her if the only thing that she's going to be doing is coming in contact with chulin and rendering it tummy, because that's only an isser derabanan. That's what we permit you to do because of darkei shalom, to work with her and help her prepare her chulin. It's not going to be for you to eat, but if she needs your help and you'll help her grind it, that's not a problem. But the seifa is an issue, is that once the water hits the flour, then the dough becomes subject to the mitzvah of challah. That's where we're concerned that there's mamish and isser d'oraisa. If a woman who's tameh touches that challah tithe before giving it to the kohen. So the question, of course, is, So then what do we do today? I mean, all women who take challah are in a state of tumah. So there must be a way of explaining that, either because challah bisman hazez derabanan, or because even if you're going to argue that challah bisman hazez deoraisa, in a situation where everyone is tamei and there's no other option, you have no other choice. But in a situation like this, where chaverim, where people who are scholarly only take challah in a state of tahara, you're not allowed to aid and abet a woman to render the challah tameh, which was potentially an isser deoraisa. Alan.
Is there any significance to the fact that it's the wife of the chaver and the wife of the
No, it's speaking in the vernacular. It's speaking in the vernacular now. It's just typically this is what happens. It's the women who are the bread preparers.
And right. Presumably a wife of a chaver would be knowledgeable because of her husband.
Because of her husband. Correct. Okay. Correct. So now the Gemara says Uraminu. So let's raise a contradiction. You're telling me that we give you permission to go ahead and work with a wife of an Am Haaretz, even though, there may be a problem with her coming in contact with the Tumah D'Rabbanan. So it says in the Braisa, Tochenen u'mafkiden eitzel ochle shvias ve'etzel ochle perosein b'tumah, avolo le'ochle shvias v'lo le'ochle perosein b'tumah. It says that you're allowed to grind your flour and leave it in the possession for safekeeping with someone who eats Shemitah produce illicitly and someone who eats their produce in a state of tumah. That's okay, because we're not worried that they're going to tamper with it or swap it when it's in their possession. But what you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to grind their grain. You're not allowed to help them grind their grain if they eat their produce in a state of tumah. Now, why then is it okay in our Mishnah to aid and abet this woman to grind her grain, even though she eats the chulin in a state of tumah, and why in this brisa is it not okay? So Amar Abaye Hasan bekohen hachashu lechol truma betuma askinan dahavale tuma deoraisa. So Abaye says that brisa is not talking about chulin grain that you're helping the Am Haaretz grind. That brisa is talking about where the Am Haaretz is a kohen, and you're helping him grind his truma grain. There, if he touches the grain in a state of tumah, he's committing an isser deoraisa. And that's why you're not allowed to aid and abet him, because exposing truma to tumah is an isser deoraisa. So that's why we don't allow you to help him. So ihachi mafkidin. So 1 second, you're telling me that Bryce is talking about giving over your tohar truma over to a kohen am haaretz, and that we say is okay as long as you're not grinding his truma, but you can take your tohar truma and leave it for safekeeping with a kohen am haaretz. How can that be? Or a minu, let's show you another brisa. Mafkidin truma eitzel Yisrael am haaretz v'lo eitzel kohen am haaretz mipnei shalibo gaspa. Even though you're allowed to leave your tohar truma in the hands of a Yisrael who's an am haaretz, and you're not worried that he's going to touch it or render it tameh, but you can't leave it in the possession of a kohen who's an am haaretz, because kohanim who are am haaretzim are even worse than a Yisrael who's an am haaretz. Why is that? The reason is because since a kohen is used to eating truma, like a Yisrael who's an am haaretz has a certain reverence for holy food, so he's not going to tamper with it. But the kohen, he says, hey, that's stuff that I eat all the time. He has no sense of reverence or special consideration for that. So he's not going to feel bad if he touches it. I touch it all the time. So how can you tell me then, the first part of that brisa that you just cited said, you Abai, you're telling me we're talking about truma, and you said the reason why you can't grind it with him is because you're aiding and abetting him to expose truma to tumah. Well, then why are you allowed to keep it your truma tohar with him for safekeeping? So Amar Rabbi Ilah hacha b'mayaskinon b'chli cheres hamukav tzamid pasil. The answer is that the brisa only permits you to leave your tohar truma with him if it's sealed in a box, sealed in a container that is wrapped with what's called samid pasil, where it's double sealed. And therefore, there's no reason, even if he were to touch the container, he would not be matame the contents. But the Gemara says, but that's not sufficient, because v'leicho shema tisitenu ishto nida. You should still worry that maybe his wife, when she's in a state of nida, will pick up the box. And we know the halacha is that even though there's no tumas maga, there's no tumah that can just by coming in contact, and there's no tumas ohel by something that's sealed in a double sealed in a box. But if someone who is a tumas zav or tumas nida picks up that box, then the contents do become tamei. It's called tumas hesed. So how's that going to solve the problem if the guy's an am haaretz and his wife's an am haaretz? So the Gemara says, Ela amar Reb Yirmiyah lo kasha, kan bepero shehuchshiru, kan bepero shelo huchshiru. The answer is very simple. In both cases of the brisa, we're talking about grinding truma. The first case is where you've ground your own truma and you want to leave it for safekeeping with the am haaretz. There, you know that you're dealing with grain that has not been exposed to any liquids, and therefore it's not yet ready to be makabel tumah. It can't be makabel tumah, even though it's truma. If someone tummy were to touch it, it would not render it tummy because it has not yet come in contact with water. But when you're aiding and abetting a kohen am haaretz to grind his grain, that's truma. You don't know whether that grain has been exposed to water or not, and that's why the brisa says you can't do it, because for all you know, you're helping him be metame truma. Okay, or a minu. So now let's raise another contradiction from another brisa. Hamoli chitin letochen kusi letochen am haaretz, harei elu becheskasan lemaiser v'lashvius avalo letuma. So this brisa also says that if you bring your grain to a grinder, a professional grinder, who's either a kusi, a Samaritan, or an am haaretz, then you can trust that they're not going to swap the grain and give you stuff that hasn't been tied. They'll give you back the original grain that you gave them in its ground state, in its flour state. But the only thing you do have to worry about is that they're going to expose it to tumah. So the Gemara's question is, how come in the previous brisa we weren't concerned about leaving it with them for safekeeping? So the Gemara says, but haimai rumya lavu kimna beperish lehuchshuru. The Gemara says, why are you repeating the same question? We just explained that the previous brisa is talking about where you know that your grain was not exposed to liquid, and that's why it's not susceptible to tumah. And this brisa would therefore be talking about grain that has been exposed to liquid and therefore is susceptible to tumah, and that's why you can't trust the am haaretz. So the Gemara says, Udekarila, my karila. So then why did you bother asking the question? Didn't you know that the answer was obvious? Because we just gave this answer. So the Gemara answers, Mishum tekaboy lamirmi achriti Allah. Because we brought this brisa not to raise that question, but to raise a different question. Because the whole brisa is predicated on the assumption that when you give grain to an am haaretz, you don't have to worry that he's going to swap it for other grain. You can trust him that whatever you gave him, he's going to grind it up, and he'll return you the original grain that you gave him, so you don't have to re-tithe. So let's look at a contradiction to that. We trust that it's still the same grain. It's not, doesn't have any agricultural stigmas, and therefore whatever you gave him, he's going to give you back. You don't have to worry that he's going to swap it. Or a minus, here's the contradiction. That if a person, the Brisa says, that if a man gives his mother-in-law dough, and he says, Mom, do me a favor, would you mind baking the challah for Shabbos? We don't have an oven, we're still a young couple, would you take care of it? So the mother says, sure, or he even gives her flour. He says, would you take care of it and bake us challahs? I love your challahs, Mom. So she says, sure, my beloved son-in-law, what would I not do for my son-in-law? So she takes the dough or the flour. There, the Brisa says, whatever she gives back to you, you have to re-tithe, because you have to worry that maybe she's going to swap it. She's going to swap it, and she'll swap it if she's not a learned woman. She may swap it for grain that has not been properly tithed. So the Gemara says, you see from here that an am haaretz is suspect of swapping. Why in the previous brisa did you say that an am haaretz is not suspect in swapping? So the Gemara answers, Hasam kidekatani taima, Amar Reb Yehuda wrote sahi betakanas bita ubosha mechasana. The answer, it's a special case. Mothers-in-law are a special case. You always have to worry about mothers-in-law, but not in the way that you think. No, not in the way that you think. A mother-in-law always wants to make sure that her daughter will have the best food. And she's also very concerned about not embarrassing herself in front of her son-in-law. So let's say she burns the challah that she was using your flour for. that you, the son-in-law, gave her the flour, and she left it in for too long. It didn't rise, or whatever happened. So she's going to be too embarrassed to give you back a burnt challah or a flat
you complimented her so much about her challah.
That's right. You love her challah so much. So therefore, that's the case where you have to suspect that she may swap it for other grain because she wants the best loaf of bread to go to her daughter and son-in-law. So the Gemara says, okay, you're telling me that it's only with mothers-in-law, ula alma lo kaishin, and you're not worried about other scenarios? V'hatznan hanosin lepundakis ma'asr eshuhunosin laveshunotel himena mipnei shemach lefes. What about this case? A yeshiva bacher is learning in yeshiva with his Rabbi, and he has a dormitory. So the head of the dorm, the den mother or the pundakis, the innkeeper, if you, the yeshiva bacher, give her a grain or flour to bake, you have to retithe it when she gives it back to you, because maybe she swapped it. So you see that over there too, it's not just the mother-in-law that we're worried about, it's any Am Haaretz that we have to be concerned about. The Gemara says, no, there too is a special case. Hasa Murya va'amra bar beirav lechol chamima va'ana echol karira, because she's going to say to herself, oh, it's pasnished. He gave me the dough this morning, and I just baked the bread in the morning. He's not coming back till the evening. It's going to be a little shtickle stale and cold by the time he comes back. So it's pasnish that I should have fresh bread and he should have stale bread. So that's why she thinks she's doing it because she has such respect for a Talmud Chacham. And that's the reason why you have to retithe it out of suspicion that she may just do it because she has respect for you. So in any situation where you're concerned that an Am Haaretz is going to do it out of respect to swap the grain, then you have to worry about swapping. But in a case where the guy's a professional grinder, there's no reason to suspect that he's going to swap the grain and that you have to retithe it. But the Gemara says, but still, va'akati la'alma lo chayshinan, still you're not worried. V'hatanya eishes chaver tochenes im eishes am haaretz bisman shehi tameya, avalo bisman shehi tahora. Listen to this, Bryson. A woman who's the wife of a chaver, so in other words, she's a learned woman and she's always meticulous to handle her chulin in a state of tahara, right? Let's say her friend, the Am Haaretz, asks her a favor. Would you mind helping me grind the grain? You won't have to touch it. Just help me grind it. So the Brisa says it's perfectly fine for her to help because you're not concerned that she's going to put anything in her mouth, because she always has a policy that whenever she grinds grain in a state of tumah, she never touches any of the food because she wants to make sure that it stays tahor, right? So she just stands on the periphery of the mill grinding, but she doesn't handle the grain directly. So there you don't have to worry. However, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, af bizman shehi temeya lo tidchon mipnei shechaverta nosenes la v'yochelas. And Reb Shimon ben Elazar disagrees. He says, no, that's only in a situation where she's by herself. But let's say she's with a friend who's an Am Haaretz. The Am Haaretz may have a negative influence upon her, and she says, no, take a little nash. We're grinding the grain together. Take a little nash of the parched grain and take a bite. And she may not remember. She's like, because her friend is noshing, so she's going to nosh too. So Rav Shimon ben Elazar says that it's not permitted for her to grind the grain because she's helping her expose it to tumah. So, and therefore she shouldn't help her grind it if she doesn't want to end up eating food that's going to end up becoming tamei. So the Gemara says, but the question is like this. So hashta mignav gan v'chilufe lo michlafa. He says, look, this grain does not belong to either woman. This grain belongs to the woman who's married to the Am Haaretz. It belongs to her husband. So what a chutzpah. The husband left for work, and she's in charge of grinding the grain. It's not her grain, it's the husband's grain. So she's stealing. She's mamish stealing from the husband for her to nash and for her friend to nash on the grain. So if you suspect an Am Haaretz of nashing on something that's not there, which is to commit an act of geneva, so surely you should be concerned that maybe they're going to swap grain. If they're suspect of stealing, they should surely be suspect of swapping. That's the Gemara's question. The Gemara's answer is that that's a cynical approach. Amar of Yosef Hasam Nami Muriya va'amra Tura midishe ka'achim. There too, it's not really stealing, because the wife of the Am Haaretz says, listen, even an ox, when it plows a field, is entitled to nibble on some of the grain. It's not stealing if in the course of grinding my husband's grain I take a little nibble on it. I'm no worse than the ox that's pulling the plow. And and therefore it's certainly okay for me, it's certainly okay for my friend, if we're doing all this work to prepare the bread for the house, it's perfectly okay for us to nibble on some of the parched grain. And that's why it's not considered to be stealing. But everyone knows that it's unethical to swap. If someone gives you grain to grind, you're not supposed to swap it for other grain. And that's why you can trust the Am Ha'aretz that he's not going to swap it, and that's why you don't have to retithe it. Have a good Erev Shabbos.